I never asked for revenge. In fact, all I wanted was a little peace and a sense of belonging. But if there is one lesson I have learned in my 19 years, it is this: evil deeds do not go unanswered. Life always collects a debt, whether one believes in destiny or not. And I have discovered that even the softest whisper of betrayal echoes until it is answered in kind. I remember the day I realized I was, in my parents' eyes, unwanted in my own home. It was a crisp morning, a few weeks after my 19th birthday, an age they apparently considered practically 20, and I was sitting at the kitchen table. My father and mother sat across from me, wearing the stern faces they used whenever they wanted to deliver news I was sure I wouldn't like. My father's brows were knitted, and my mother drummed her fingers on the wooden tabletop. I could practically taste the tension in the air. "We've decided," my mother began, "that since you're almost 20, you should find your own place. You can manage on your own." A lump formed in my throat. "But the house belongs to all of us," I said softly, reminding her of the inheritance situation. My grandmother had passed it down to our entire family, not just to them alone. I thought that fact would count for something. My father shrugged and looked down at the table, unwilling, or perhaps unable, to speak up against my mother's decree. He never went against her wishes. Instead, his eyes darted toward the framed photograph hanging on the kitchen wall, one with all of us, my father, mother, my older brother Lucas, and me, smiling in front of the house at a family gathering. I think it briefly reminded him that the house was, indeed, also mine, but if he felt any sympathy, he kept it pressed inside, where he kept most of his thoughts. Obedience was his code. My mother squared her shoulders. "We don't intend to make demands on Lucas," she said, as if reading my mind. She always anticipated my next question. "He's a special case." Lucas, my older brother, I had long resented the way my mother favored him. He was nearly 25, yet he neither worked nor studied. He spent his days lounging in his bedroom, fiddling with computer games, or meeting friends somewhere in town and returning with an air of triumph as if he had conquered kingdoms. Meanwhile, I juggled small jobs whenever I could, trying to save money for a future apartment. "Lucas is special," my mother repeated. "Your father and I have decided that it's best he stays here. But you, well, I think you'll do fine on your own." The unspoken message hurt more than I could admit out loud. They wanted him, not me. My father remained silent as usual, confirming with his silence that I was on my own. The first few months after that encounter blurred into a haze. I moved out with little more than a backpack of clothes and a bundle of regrets. Some nights, I slept on a friend's couch. Other nights, I rented a cheap room that I could afford only sporadically. The city felt cruel and sprawling, and I had no official place to call my own. But slowly, determinedly, I found my footing. I managed to secure a job in a cramped office building. I won't name the place. Let the company be called so-and-so. The manager at so-and-so, a man named Richard, hired me after I applied 3 times in a row. He was a bit gruff, but I caught a glimmer of sincerity in him that made me think he wouldn't betray me. I was right about that, at least for a while. I threw myself into my work, doing everything from filing documents to preparing deliveries, always hustling for extra shifts. Life started to look better. I saved up enough to rent a tiny apartment, the kind with paint flaking from the walls, but it was mine alone, and that felt like victory. During those early days of independence, I rarely thought about my parents or Lucas. My bitterness receded just enough for me to focus on survival. But one evening, I overheard a hushed conversation at so-and-so that made me realize the deeper cost of betrayal. While I was delivering a file folder to the manager's office, I overheard him talking to another supervisor about cutting corners, possibly in illegal ways. They laughed about it, as though it was a small matter. Something in my stomach churned. I recognized a new wave of betrayal. Betrayal from people I had trusted in my fresh start. The next day, I confronted Richard, but he shrugged it off, said I had nothing to worry about, and everything was perfectly normal. He didn't try to reassure me. He simply ended our discussion by hinting that if I kept my mouth shut, I wouldn't lose my job. I let it slide for a while. Survival was more pressing than moral righteousness at that point. I had rent to pay, and my best friend's couch was no longer an option. But betrayal always rots beneath the surface, waiting to burst forth. My manager's unscrupulous dealings escalated, eventually landing the company in a swirl of legal trouble. Some of the other employees, innocently roped into his scheme, risked losing their jobs, and so ended up in a meltdown of investigations. I was furious. I had tried to stay loyal, believing that maybe I was overreacting. In the end, I realized I was enabling wrongdoing. Revenge came not from me personally, but from the unstoppable wave of justice rolling in from the outside. Richard was fired outright, disgraced publicly, and those who had followed his unethical plans were indicted. By a stroke of luck, the authorities determined that I, along with a few others, had no knowledge of the real intricacies of his wrongdoing. So I wasn't charged or even called to testify beyond confirming a few details. Still, seeing the downfall felt complicated. Relief, yes, but also a pang of regret that I had ignored my instincts for too long. I got a new job soon after at a small marketing agency. Let that agency be called something else. The environment was more positive, and after a few months, I even earned a modest promotion. It didn't make me wealthy, but it gave me stability. That was the first time I realized that betrayal, in any form, seldom went unpunished for long. Around this same time, my thoughts started drifting back to my parents and Lucas. As the months rolled on, I worried less about where I would sleep at night and more about what they were doing and why they had chosen to cast me aside. I felt an odd sense of disquiet, like a story left unfinished. Then I heard rumors. Strangely enough, through a friend of a friend who still lived near my old neighborhood. My parents had reportedly taken out a massive loan to buy Lucas a dream car. I didn't know the car's exact name, only that it was over $100,000. I believed it too. Lucas always wanted something flashy, a pristine engine with a roaring exhaust, and a sleek body that would turn heads wherever he drove. If I closed my eyes, I could picture it racing down the street, my brother's grin shining as if he were the luckiest man alive. My mother supported the decision wholeheartedly, and my father, even if he disagreed, would never muster the backbone to protest. That was who he had become. The cost, though, was astronomical for a family of modest means. There was talk that they were struggling to keep up with the interest payments and that a financial meltdown was looming. When I heard this, I shook my head in disbelief. The house was old but well kept, a gift from my grandmother, the one place that had bound us together. It seemed impossible that they would risk it for a car, but that was exactly what they did. It became an all-consuming problem for them. Piling interest, demands from the bank, overdue bills that soared higher with each passing day. And it happened sooner than anyone could have predicted. After fewer than 10 years, much fewer in fact, my parents lost the house. The bank took it away, foreclosing on the place that had once been a testament to my grandmother's love for our family. Rumor had it that the final blow landed even before Lucas could fully pay off the dream car. Whether he managed to keep the vehicle or not, I never heard the details. All I knew was that the house, our family's heritage, was gone. I remember the day my father called me. We'd never spoken on the phone much. He rarely even texted, yet I saw his name on my screen. Against my better judgment, I answered. His voice came haltingly, as though it carried a freight of shame. We lost the house," he mumbled. "Your mother and I have nowhere to go. Lucas, he's gone off somewhere with that car, and he's not answering us." A dull ache spread through my chest. We had all grown up in that house, the one my grandmother left us. My parents never truly valued my presence there, yet I still felt some nostalgia. Part of me wanted to say, "I'm sorry," but my father cut me off, his voice trembling. "We need a place to stay." We thought, "Well, you have your own place now, don't you?" I took a deep breath. Memories of that morning at the kitchen table flooded back. The stern expressions, the talk of me being almost 20, entirely capable of managing by myself, therefore unwelcome in their house. Now, ironically, it was they who needed shelter. My father's voice pleaded across the line, as if begging for a measure of pity, and behind him I could hear my mother faintly demanding to know if I had agreed yet. A swirl of anger and heartbreak rose in me. You said I was nearly 20 and should fend for myself, I reminded him. Maybe you can manage on your own now. You're almost 60. He started to respond, but I hung up before the conversation could continue. My mother texted me a long, emotional string of messages that night, calling me ungrateful and hurtful, but I didn't answer. I felt a pang of guilt. Despite their betrayal, they were still my parents. Yet I also remembered how easily they had dismissed me. Revenge often grows in the spaces where empathy should reside, but has been trampled beyond recognition. I was no saint, but I had realized some pains cut too deep to forgive. In the weeks following that phone call, I wrestled with my conscience, but I remained resolute in my decision. It wasn't that I wished to see my parents homeless, it was simply that I had no interest in being cast aside again whenever my mother decided I was a problem. I had worked tirelessly to secure my own life, and I wasn't about to lose it all. I had witnessed how betrayal, left unaddressed, corrodes everything. There would be no quick absolution for them, no return to what had been. They were forced to find temporary lodging in a friend's cramped basement. Hardly the life they had envisioned for themselves at almost 60. During that turbulent time, I thought often of Lucas. He had vanished when the financial storm hit, leaving my parents to face the consequences alone. I heard tidbits here and there. Someone claimed they saw him cruising the city streets in his prized car, tailed by a few irresponsible friends. Others hinted that he might have driven across the country, searching for some imaginary paradise where he wouldn't be weighed down by bills or parental scoldings. I didn't know which rumor held truth, but I suspected he would keep running until reality caught up to him, and in the end, reality found him with a vengeance. A few months later, a mutual acquaintance tracked me down at my new marketing agency. This acquaintance, who had known Lucas from years ago, informed me that Lucas ended up embroiled in a disastrous scheme, something to do with forging documents to secure money for expensive repairs on that very car. The law came for him, just as it had come for my old manager Richard. My brother was arrested, and from what I gathered, there was little chance of a lenient verdict. I felt a swirl of complicated emotion. I hadn't intended to see him ruined, but he had chosen a path of selfishness, living beyond his means, hurting others in the process. He had betrayed even the parents who loved him most. If life has a ledger of debts, Lucas's was tallied and collected in one fell swoop. I did not show up at the hearing. I did not send any letters or money to help with bail. Sometimes I felt the faint tug of familial ties telling me to do something, but then I remembered the day my parents told me to leave. I remembered how Lucas always nodded in agreement behind them, never once defending me. A part of me realized that I could not forgive that kind of betrayal. Even if I wanted to, something in me refused. The rift between us was too deep, and I had neither the energy nor the will to pretend otherwise. Time passed, and I continued my own life. I found a small group of friends, people who had also been disappointed by those they trusted, and discovered a kind of fellowship in our scars. We supported one another. We went to modest restaurants, took road trips to budget-friendly cabins, and sat around telling our stories of betrayals old and new, each of us marveling at how fate, or coincidence, or some universal justice had come around to punish those who hurt us. I also met a kind neighbor in my apartment complex named Zoe. She was older than me by a few years, had a gentle smile, and a penchant for offering homemade cookies in the hallway. Sometimes we would chat about life. One day, I told her a portion of my history, about losing my grandmother's house, about my parents' betrayal, about my refusal to help them when the bank evicted them. Zoe leaned back in her chair, letting out a quiet breath. "I'm not going to tell you what to do," she said gently, "but I get the sense you're still angry. It's justified, sure. but don't let it eat you alive. I gave a short nod. I don't think about them as much anymore. It's just, I'm not going to forgive them. Zoe's expression was thoughtful. Maybe you don't need to, she said, as long as you understand you're choosing your own path. That's what matters. That was the closest thing to a resolution I had felt in a long time. I didn't need to reconcile. I didn't need to let them move in with me or pretend nothing had happened. I simply had to keep living, forging my own future. Eventually, word reached me that my parents had attempted to approach other relatives for help after the bank seized the house. Most relatives turned them away, remembering how my mother would boast about Lucas's new car as though it was a symbol of the family's collective success, while belittling the rest of them. One aunt, in particular, felt offended that my mother never even invited her to see the newly remodeled house before the foreclosure. My parents' arrogance had made them quite a few enemies, so they found no warm welcomes. In some ways, that was the revenge they had earned. They were forced to face the consequences of their actions alone. I heard more bits of gossip. My mother insisted they would find a bigger, better place once they straightened out their finances. My father spent his days sifting through part-time jobs, trying to repay the remnants of the loan they owed for Lucas's car. They had lost nearly everything, save for a few boxes of clothes and kitchen utensils. My father reached out to me again, but I let his calls go to voicemail. Perhaps that was unkind, but I felt a distant relief each time I saw his name and did not pick up. I would not let them wedge themselves back into my life, only to hurt me again. That might sound harsh, but the memory of their betrayal still throbbed in me. I've learned that only those who have been dismissed as unwanted understand the scarring effect of such words. They become a brand across one's heart. We were supposed to share that house equally, yet they had acted as though I were a mere intruder. If they had apologized and truly meant it, perhaps we might have reached a fragile truce. But they never did. Instead, they demanded my help, seeing me as some resource they could exploit. It was too little, too late. Months turned into a year, and by the time I turned 20, my life had improved. I had a stable position in the marketing agency, and I was even taking some online courses to refine my skills. I had saved enough money to move out of my tiny apartment into a place with better light and fewer leaky pipes. Zoe helped me pack, offering me encouraging words for my next chapter, and just as I started settling in, my phone rang. This time, the call was from my mother. I answered not because I had suddenly softened my stance, but because curiosity got the best of me. "Your father and I are living in a very cramped space," she said. Her tone balanced between arrogance and desperation, a peculiar mix I had come to expect from her. "We need to borrow some money to pay the interest we still owe. The bank is relentless." I clenched my jaw. "You do remember that I was forced to leave the house with practically nothing, right?" She huffed into the phone. "We had no choice back then. Lucas needed our support, and you were strong enough to handle life yourself." I almost laughed. "You had a choice. You just chose him over me." My mother mumbled something about me being ungrateful, then tried to remind me that she was my mother and I owed her respect. I took a breath, steadying my voice. "Remember how you told me I was unwelcome in your house, even though it was also my inheritance? You never once considered how that would affect me. Now you're almost 60, right? I'm sure you can find a way to manage as well as I have." She fell silent, and for a moment I thought the line had gone dead. Then her voice came in small, strangled bursts. "Please, I never expected to be in this situation." But I heard no real apology, only fear. My mother's pride was deeply wounded by her predicament, yet she still refused to acknowledge the part she had played in alienating me. The chance for genuine reconciliation was gone. I didn't hang up this time. Instead, I quietly told her I couldn't help, then set down the phone. That was the last time I spoke to her directly. I sometimes wondered if my father bore any resentment for how things turned out, but I suspect he was too entrenched in his pattern of obedience to my mother's wishes. That pattern had led him to lose the house. That pattern had also led him to stand by her side when they told me to leave. Betrayal or cowardice, I do not know which label fits best. In the end, He too suffered from the decisions he never had the courage to challenge. As for Lucas, I heard he served time. When he was released, he attempted to reach me through social media. The messages he sent were short, and each carried a faint sense of desperation. I read them in numb silence. I messed up, one read. I realize it now. We should talk. Another simply said, I'm out. I need to start over. Please help. Each message reignited the sting of my old memories. How Lucas sneered when my mother kicked me out. How he never once spoke up. Now he wanted my help? I never responded. To this day, the messages remain there, unopened and ignored. Some might say that's cruel of me, but I can't find it in me to pretend everything is fine. The cost of betrayal is high, and forgiveness is not guaranteed when trust has been broken again and again. In a strange twist of fate, I eventually reconnected with an old neighbor who had known my grandmother. We chatted over coffee one afternoon, reminiscing about better times. He told me that my grandmother had always intended the house to be a place for the whole family, a sanctuary. Hearing that reminded me of the heartbreak, but it also reinforced my resolve never to allow that kind of betrayal to happen again. I said goodbye to the neighbor with a sense of closure. The house that had once been our family's anchor was gone, but the memory of what it meant would remain with me. The cruel truth is, my parents had taken that dream for granted, leveraging it for Lucas's car and ignoring the inevitable consequences. Life moved on. I found a small circle of colleagues who liked my ideas and helped me build a respectable portfolio. My manager at the marketing agency recognized my efforts, granting me a steady raise and even the occasional bonus for successful campaigns. The hours were sometimes long and stressful, but for the first time in my life, I felt like I was forging my own destiny, not living under the shadow of someone else's favoritism. I also learned that even in a cutthroat environment like marketing, decency can exist. Yes, some people tried to claw their way up at the expense of others. Yet, if they were dishonest or underhanded, their actions inevitably caught up with them. I witnessed a fellow employee attempt to sabotage a coworker's presentation to steal the credit. But that coworker uncovered the plot, documented everything, and presented it to our boss. The saboteur was dismissed. Yet another instance of how bad deeds rarely go unpunished. If there is a guiding principle in the world, it seems to be that no one truly escapes wrongdoing forever. Through it all, I have guarded my independence. I live in a modest but comfortable apartment now. The sun shines through my windows in the mornings, and I'm reminded that I'm free to shape my day however I choose. Sometimes I sit at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, reflecting on how I arrived here. My parents insisted I leave, so I did. They prized Lucas above anyone else, and they ended up paying a steep price. The bank took the house they were so sure belonged to them and them alone. And when they sought my aid, I said no. Maybe that refusal was my own brand of revenge, or maybe it was simply the natural course of events. They reaped what they sowed, as the old saying goes. I admit, there are moments, particularly late at night, when a pang of guilt nips at me. Did I let bitterness consume me? Could I have offered them a couch to sleep on, even for a short while? But each time, I recall how I felt when they dismissed my existence, and how my mother's voice carried that air of finality when she sent me away. There was no apology, no regret in the months after. They made their bed. Only when they lost the house, only when their world caved in, did they remember me as a potential lifeline. Betrayal's consequence was swift for them. They lost the home, the stability, the dream they once boasted of. And my father, with his unwavering obedience to my mother's demands, tied his own fate to hers. Lucas's dream car turned into a nightmare for the entire family, setting off a domino effect that destroyed what little bond we had left. Some might read my story and think it's one of cold-heartedness, but that's not the way I see it. It's simply a cycle of cause and effect. My parents caused my exile. They reaped the effect of losing everything. Lucas caused his own downfall by forging documents. He reaped the effect of a prison cell. There is no forgiveness here because no one ever attempted to make amends in a genuine way. Even if they had, I don't think I would have been able to forget. Betrayal cuts deep. One might learn to live with the scar, but it never really fades. I'm almost 20 now, 19 to be exact, but as my mother liked to say, practically 20. If there's any lesson in my story, it's that sometimes you have to stand up for yourself, even if it means turning away from the people who gave you life. Family ties can be wonderful, but not when they suffocate or belittle you. And no matter how much someone tries to manipulate situations to benefit themselves, like my parents did for my brother, it eventually unravels. This is where I stand today, in my own apartment, paying my own bills, looking forward to the next day's work with cautious optimism. I have new acquaintances. Some might become friends, some might not, but I have learned to watch carefully. If they betray me, I will walk away without hesitation, knowing that they too will face their consequences in the end. If they prove trustworthy, I will hold them close. As for my parents, I still receive sporadic calls or messages from them, usually when they're in financial dire straits. My mother tries to evoke pity, reminding me that they took care of me as a child, that they gave me everything. Did they give me everything, though? Or was it my grandmother's legacy that they commandeered and then lost? My father's messages are sometimes softer, but I can sense the same request hidden within them. We need money, we need a place, help us. My responses are distant. I might send a single line telling them I wish them well, but I do not offer further assistance. I can't. To do so would be to invite them back into my life as if none of this ever happened. I can picture them growing older, inching past 60, still searching for the stability they once enjoyed. They might rent a small apartment in some cheaper part of the city, possibly even find a measure of comfort. But it won't be the warm nest of my grandmother's house. That was taken by the bank, a glaring example of how quickly greed and poor decisions can unravel a life. And Lucas, wherever he is now, might be trying to rebuild from scratch, living with the stain of a criminal record, far from the shining star child my mother always hailed. Sometimes I allow myself a flicker of pity for them all, but it lasts only a heartbeat. Then I remember the sting of being told I was unwanted in my own inheritance. The heartbreak of packing my meager belongings and leaving everything I knew. I remember the nights spent in fear, not sure where I would sleep the next day. They had left me to fend for myself, and so I did. Now they must do the same, and if that is considered revenge, I accept it as the simplest form of justice. Betrayal does not vanish into thin air. It echoes until the scales are balanced. There is no triumphant laugh, no proud sense of victory, only a steady understanding. Actions have consequences. My parents and brother acted out of favoritism, entitlement, and disregard for my well-being. Life corrected them with a harsh lesson: mortgage foreclosure, legal trouble, and estrangement. Perhaps that is how the world sometimes sets things right. I sit here now, recalling every fact from that painful motif. The day they told me I was almost 20 and could manage on my own, the house that was rightfully all of ours, the older brother who was never made to work or study, my mother's fixation on her favorite child, and my father's silent obedience. The ruinous loan for a dream car worth more than $100,000. The tsunami of interest that drowned their finances until the bank took their home. Then, ironically, the parents who once discarded me as almost 20 ended up asking me for a place to stay. My final refusal, reminding them they were almost 60 and would figure it out. That is the shape of my life now, and though it's not free from pain, it is mine. I have no illusions about an easy future, but I move forward without regrets over how I responded. If they had chosen a fairer path, we might have been a family still, but they sowed betrayal, and betrayal rarely goes unanswered. I've learned enough to know that the word family means more than just blood ties. It's about loyalty, respect, and a willingness to protect one another. They showed none of that to me, and now they know how it feels to be cast aside. perhaps that is the only closure any of us will ever find. When someone breaks that trust, there is a debt to be paid, and the ledger of life keeps meticulous records.